Hello out there in the YouTubeverse, it is Max, and I am here with a deck tech matchup guide and overall general review of the Emerald Steel aggressive discard deck. I was able to take this to 3 different set championships over the course of the 2-weekend block, and I was able to get at least 8th place in every single one, if not top 4. I wasn't able to get the mat, but I did get the stitch. So I got that going for me, which is pretty exciting, and I also got a ton of games in with the Emerald Steel discard deck, so I wanted to share my experience with you, maybe give you some idea of what to do going into the Atlanta event. Minimally, you'll know at least kind of how to play against this deck, so hopefully this helps you out. I wanted to go over the deck, and then I'll get into the game plan, inking, mulliganing, and then the specific matchups after that. So the intro to the deck is pretty straightforward, right? We're an aggressive deck out of the gate, and we're trying to make the opponent discard their late game threats by using either targeted discard or the effects built into a lot of our aggressive characters. Key cards for the match are pretty straightforward and very dependent on the matchup, but the most obvious kind of line or starting hand that you want to keep is Merfolk on 1, Flynn Rider on 2, Prince John, greediest of all, on 3. Pretty straightforward. This deck also, as you can see looking at the list, has a decent amount of flex slots, not a ton. I put it down to about 4 or 5 flex slots here. I think Lucifer and Don Carnage on 5 are both flexible. We've seen Ray on 5. We've seen Cusco on 5. There's a lot of flexibility there. Same with Lucifer. It depends on what you want and what matchups you're worried about. And the other one here is the 2 Baboom that I am playing. Those could certainly be Rise of the Titans. They could be something completely different altogether, depending on what you feel like you need a little bit more meat to be able to overcome. So I'm going to roll right from this little introduction here straight into the game plan that involves inking, mulliganing, and all that good stuff. I'm going to try to keep this concise but impactful, which is not my strong suit. So I'm going to do my best here to be intentional. When it comes to your game plan against an unknown opponent, I will get into matchups in a later section. When talking about an unknown opponent specifically, the kind of baseline concept of this deck is achieve Merfolk on 1, Flynn on 2, John on 3, Friar Tuck on 4, and then like some 5-drop, Don Carnage, Beast, Lucifer, something like that. Depending on where the game has gone, those get better or worse. So that's the general principle, right? Is we're trying to make sure we're pressuring the opponent, and that is kind of the first nod. We also have the less in the blind good hook into Smee, into Quest. Smee's good in certain matchups. He's not as strong in other matchups. Smee's good because he is aggressive, and he does generally trade with an entire card or more in some cases, and the opponent has to respect it. So I don't love always leading on Smee, because if they have a clean answer, it's not as nice as late in the game when they're trying desperately to top deck anything they can. They'll trade 2 to 3 units into a Smee sometimes to take it off the board. So it really depends. 2-drop Ursula sometimes is better than Flynn Rider. Same with Smee. In some matchups, he's better than Flynn Rider. In some matchups, he's worse. Same with Ursula, 2-drop. Some matchups, she's insane. Some matchups, she's not playable. It really, really depends. So it's all about, in the game 1 matchup, I feel, trying to be proactive and make sure you're making the next best play to emphasize the strength of the play you made the turn before. For example, the reason I say the ideal curve is Merfolk into Flynn Rider into Prince John, because you can sit on Merfolk. If they play a Captain Hook on their turn 1, you're like, well, great, I can't quest with my Merfolk. You're still going to play your Flynn Rider on 2, pass back, and then on 3, you're going to go, I'm going to play John, and now all of a sudden I've unlocked the ability to quest for 4. Because now they're not just going down 1 card, they're going down a card and you're going up a card. So they are attacking into your character, giving you the opportunity to draw a card, or for them to discard a card from the effect, getting you to draw a card, which is going to help you cleanly answer the other cards they're playing while still able to progress your game plan of questing. So you can take those cards, turn them into negative card for your opponent, positive card for you. So it can be really, especially if there's a trade in here, it can be very, very positive for you. So those are the things you want to try to set up. Similarly, this deck does card advantage in the way of 3-drop Ursula and Songs. You can make your opponent go down 2 cards with Sudden Chill and and Ursula, you can conversely blow up their board with Let the Storm Rage on and draw 2 cards, which sometimes wins the matchup on its own, depending on what you're playing against. So there are some really strong things that you can be doing and some things that you really need to watch out for. So the deck is very polarizing in that you want to be able to make these aggressive decisions, but you also want to be able to make sure you understand what the key 1 to 2 cards are to hold your opponent off long enough that you can continue to pressure for the win. So it plays a lot like the purple-green tempo decks in that respect, and there is a ton of overlap in the character choices there within the emerald color. So it makes total sense, right? When it comes to inking, I tend to be wary of songs. And if I have 1 song in my hand, that is typically a card I will ink unless I know that my song is safe and it's impactful to keep. Strength of a Raging Fire is often an early mulligan or early ink decision for me. I will mulligan them as well. Once I know what I'm on, that changes drastically, obviously. But for the most part, I will lead on that because I want to be pressuring. I don't want to be reactive. I don't have the amount of card draw like something of red-purple or comparable to a blue-red. I just don't have that repository of ability to draw. I don't have this repeat engine. John is very conditional in how he draws cards. Your opponent has to have a card to discard for you to draw a card. If they have no cards in hand and they're forced to discard, you don't get to draw a card from Prince John. So you have to be very, very decisive in when you use things and how you apply your pressure, because your card advantage engine does dry up. It's not endless like Flaversham and Items or the ability to sing and pick things up with Merlin and Mim, things like that. It doesn't work quite as cleanly as either of those strategies do when it comes to just pure card advantage. So just be careful there. A couple other things to keep in mind. Using your characters to sing Sudden Chill. Ursula 2-drop can do this really well. So Ursula on your 2 into John on 3 into then that turn 3 sing with Ursula can wreck an opponent's hand really hard. So you have cool lines like that that aren't as aggressive or assertive as the Merfolk into Flynn into John, but they do have a lot of value. So just going like Merfolk into 2-drop Ursula sometimes is really, really solid. When it comes to 2-drop Ursula, you do not have to play her on turn 2. That's not a requirement. She's not always at her best on turn 2. Again, when I get into matchups, there are certain matchups you absolutely want to play her on 2 if you have her, but there are other times that you don't necessarily want to do that. Sudden Chill, as a rule, does not get played unless the opponent has 1 card in their hand or you're drawing a card with Prince John. Those are the only 2 times Sudden Chill gets played. Otherwise, it's ink if you need it, or if you want to sing. I guess the third kind of nominal condition would be singing it with Ursula. And again, I'd advise against it unless you're getting the last 2 cards out of their hand. I guess maybe if they have 3 cards or less. There's some flexibility there, and I can see some argument in there. But it's like so super rare. I played against opponents in the mirror match who were just firing off Sudden Chills against me. I really advise against that. It doesn't do as much. It's doing as much harm to you as it is to me. So that is not the hallmark of a great card, where if it's doing way more harm to me than it is to you, that's the hallmark of a great card. So be aware of how you're using your Sudden Chills and Hypnotizes, things like that. You can fire off Hypnotize, right? Like, that's a little less bad because it's getting you a card back no matter what, but Sudden Chill specifically is not. So kind of what I'm trying to say on the whole when it comes to inking and mulliganing and enacting a strategy is to make sure you understand what it is, and to make sure the cards that you're keeping and the cards that you're not inking are cards that help progress that. You really don't want to go from a aggressive start to, oh, well, they wiped all my units, so now I'm just going to try to sing with Ursula a couple of times and try to generate card advantage that way. It's a really hard game to win when you just hard pivot your actual strategy. The deck can win off the back of both strategies, but I can tell you right now that I will take Cursed Merfolk and as many as I can take when it comes to a matchup, and I will generally win those matches where I see Cursed Merfolk on 1, 2, or 3 in multiples, because the card is just very, very strong. It's always getting a card for itself with the discard because it's so fast out of the gate. It's really good. Worst case scenario, they shoot it, they're still going down a card unless it's specifically Let the Storm Rage on. Card is really good. I've been nothing but impressed, and I am a Cursed Merfolk truther now. That card is insane. It's probably the best 1-drop in Lorcana. and I don't want to undervalue how good that card is. So, and again, I'm not saying hard mulligan to it. Just make sure if your lead off is an aggressive one and it's assertive, try to make choices that help you impact that, right? Follow it up with more aggressive questers. Follow it up with board control. Don't worry about the discard yet. Worry about the board control. On 3, I would rather blow up their unit to let me quest for 4 more than I would rather play a Prince John and then go, okay, now do I go ahead and quest or not? Like, there's nothing wrong with going Merfolk, Smee. My 3-drop is Strength of a Raging Fire to shoot, or let Storm Rage on to shoot their opposing 2-drop down and allow me to quest for an additional 4. That's all totally okay. Similarly, using assertive cards like Captain Hook or controlling cards to make your assertive cards better is totally viable. If they're going to, I'll take out this Merfolk for free, but then the Hook gets to take down my character, and now I'm down a character, and I'm down a card in my hand, and I'm just really pinched. That's exactly what you want to do. If that's your plan, you want to make sure to go Merfolk on 1, Hook on 2, and then on 3, try to play something to continue your aggression. That's really the way to do it, is to make a decision based on how your hand has presented itself to you and try to make every decision you can to make the previous one more impactful. All right, now that we've gotten the kind of general overview handled, I want to talk about decks specifically, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about ones I played more often than ones I didn't get to play as much. And there are some archetypes I did not get to play against at all over the course of the set championship, so I don't want to speak too much into things I don't have any firsthand knowledge of. So I'm going to kick it right off with the Ruby Amethyst red-purple deck. I think this matchup is favorable. It's not ridiculously favorable, but it can be favorable for you. What you want to do is know, I think firsthand, the thing to know is they're not going to just steal damage your units down in the early part of the game. They have to challenge your units to get them off the board. That means that they are susceptible to the discard triggers from Flynn's and Merfolk. That makes the value of those cards go way up. That makes the value of Prince John go way up in the early game. So what you want to try to do is aggressively whittle down their cards in hand while they trade off for these units, so that you try to kind of lock them out of the game around the 5 ink mark. If you can lock them out of the game and lock out their hand at the 5 ink mark, and they have to spend 1 to 2 turns being able to ink fast enough or enough to get to their Madame Medusas, or if they have to stall with an uninkable in their hand and you just get to take it out, that is crazy good. For those reasons, I advise strongly not questing with Prince John, because unless they're at 7 ink, they really don't have a good way to answer him. He has Ward. If he's your only unit, obviously they can Tremaine it. But for the most part, you don't want to let yourself get set up to get Tremained. So if you can lock them out at 5 ink, pre-Tremaine, pre-be prepared, they basically can't do anything. They can't Scar, they can't Tremaine, they can't Medusa. They're just stuck. And then every uninkable they draw that costs them 6 or more ink is now susceptible to being discarded, right? You can sit on a Hypnotize or a Sudden Chill and then just blast their hand and draw more cards with John, which will let you deploy more characters down and increase the pressure. That's typically your best way to handle it. Believe it or not, this is the best time to be deploying Ursula on 2 because it's a Friends on the Other Side deck. If you can snatch their Friends on the Other Side out of their hand, it's real bad for them. It's real bad. They have a tough time winning once that card is sniped out of their hand. So I highly recommend trying to do that. Experienced pilots against this deck will know to ink Friends on the Other Side as their first ink for turn, because you cannot afford to have that get caught in your hand by an Ursula. After turn 3, they can usually sing it or just actually play it out, but they can catch themselves in a position where they do that, and then you get a follow-up song out of their hand. We can see, even from deck lists of red-purple, that they're cutting down on the number of be prepareds. They're leaning more into Scar Vicious Cheater to be able to answer a bunch of character threats that can't be touched by Bare Necessities or this 2-drop Ursula. So it's really, really impactful to play her. If you can get a card with her early, especially if it's friends on the other side, and then you can follow that up with any amount of discard, even if it's just questing with Flynn's and Merfolk, they're in such a tough spot. I had players try to not ink to try to overcome it and play more units down. I had other players who just didn't interact with that going on at all in the hopes that they could find a be prepared. Now, if you don't want to snipe their friends on the other side or you're past that point in the game, when they're on their 6th ink that turn, whether you're going before or after they go to 7, you are going to want to then play Ursula to do a hand check and see what's going on. Because if it's Scar, you may have to think about how you're questing. If it's be prepared, you just get to take it, and then they can't win, unless they have multiple copies, of course. But that really helps you overcome the hurdles there. So 2-drop Ursula, extremely good in this matchup. Obviously, starting off with like the Merfolk Flynn, John is just really, really strong. Anything you can do to shut them down as close to 5 ink or before if possible, that is the ideal way to stop Red Purple from being able to beat you. Once they can start to play Madame Medusas and Lady Tremaines and then Scars and Be Prepared, it gets a lot harder to win, but it is still very doable. And John, believe it or not, one of your best late game draws because of the ward being able to just quest for 2. And this is the reason why some pilots of this deck favor Kuzco in this spot, because it's another ward unit that they can put down and go, hey, if you don't have exactly Be Prepared, I'm probably going to win this game right now on the spot. So a lot of cool options coming out against the red-purple decks that you can leverage to win that particular match. All right, and we're talking about blue-red popsicles now, and let's be honest, this is kind of the reason this deck was able to get popular, because blue-red popsicles became the most popular deck in the metagame, and that means it falls victim very easily to very aggressive starts from this deck. They generally don't play a lot of units that can do anything against your early characters. Like, they have Red Queen of Hearts. Now, of course, those numbers are going up and things are being tailored to fight against this matchup. But red and blue just don't have a lot of early game options that help them handle the ridiculous level of aggression that you can achieve out of this deck. Especially when paired up with something like a Benja to blow up an item, they really don't have much they can do. Same game plan here as red-purple, in that you want to just whittle their hand down while making sure key cards are dealt with as easily as possible. It is totally okay to like smash 2 Smees into a Flaversham if it'll stop them from using more items. Totally fine to use Benja to blow up a Popsicle to stop them from potentially casting Flaversham on turn 4 and drawing 2 cards. There are so many things that you want to do, and the basis of this is to mitigate the opponent being able to find the cards they need to defeat you. So what you really want to do is shut down anything you can. Ursula on 2 is great to grab 1 jump ahead, or how far I'll go. Shutting down those ramp elements, if they just have to play 1 ink a turn, the blue-red deck cannot beat you. So all you have to do is just make sure you're questing a little bit here and there as you're shutting them down. That's why like Ursula is so good here. She strips a card and she quests for 2. Benja's so good because he takes out an item and he quests for 2. There's so many things that the tacked on extras are good against Popsicles that it just gives you such a favorable inroad against them. It's really awesome. And again, don't undervalue Prince John in the late game. Ward makes him super difficult to deal with. They can't Maleficent Dragon it. They can't Madame Medusa it. It just sits there and stares at them and goes, yep, I'm going to quest for 2 at a point, so I hope you have Tremaine or a Be Prepared, because otherwise I'm going to get the last 2 lore that you need. So this matchup is pretty straightforward. You just want to rush them as much as you can. This is one of the very few matchups I will hard mulligan to get very, very low drop characters to try to dispatch them. You're not worried about control, any damage dealing stuff. You basically can just ink it straight off. The only time it's really good is against finishing off a Flaversham. It's just you want to get things handled. You want to get to your low drops, and your ideal 3 is probably Benja, because you're going to have time to get Prince John down, plus maybe like a 3rd Merfolk or something on 4. Which will pretty much solidify the game for you. So yeah, I think this matchup is one of the more straightforward ones. It's, can you beat their ramp plus big cards? Can you out aggro them? It's really straightforward, but requires a lot of discipline to make sure that you're willing to mulligan as much as you need to, and to make sure you really identify the things that are super trivial in the matchup and ink those cards. Next is Amber Steel Song, and this is a tougher matchup. I think this is an unfavorable matchup for us. And the reason I say that is because A Whole New World's a real card, right? Just being able to top deck draw 7 is really rough. It can completely undo everything that you have worked to do. So that's really difficult. They also deploy a lot of very cheap characters that really favorably answer your particular threat. So they can afford to just kind of go like, turn 1 Robin Hood, hit your merfolk. Turn 2, play something else. Turn 3, shift my Robin Hood. Sing A Whole New World is the last card in my hand. It's really tough to overcome this matchup. Robin Hood, Big Cinderella, all their shifts are really good against you. Queen's probably the weakest shift against you just because she has 3 willpower. She's able to be taken out by some of your removal. But on the whole, this matchup is extremely hard. They can bare necessities out your discard and key cards in the matchup, your removal, while still being able to add to the board and gain lore through the use of Sleepy's Flute, or be able to ramp into bigger characters with the Lantern, or be able to put down a hard-to-deal-with location with the Pride Lands. Any version of Steel Song is really hard to answer. I think the best game plan against Steel Song typically, sorry if you heard the page flip there, is to try to make sure you answer their key threats as best you can. Let the Storm Rage on look some of its best here, being able to pick off Robins and Little Cinderellas before they can shift. The key really is making them pay ink for A Whole New World. If they pay ink for A Whole New World and you can manage to go into your next turn with the ability to use the ink from the 7 cards first, you have a slightly favored position with those 7 cards and can maybe manage to eke out something using 2-drop Ursulas to snatch any key songs and hopefully any removal to be able to answer these other threats. But it is an extremely tough matchup. Moving from bad to worse, we're talking about Blue Steel, and this matchup is even worse than the Steel Song matchup in a lot of respects, because the characters that are being deployed on the Blue Steel side are just so much more powerful. They consistently play Tinkerbells. They consistently play big characters that can close out a game and answer multiple of your characters without any problems. It's a really tough matchup. The reason this deck being the Emerald Steel deck, was able to become what it is because this Blue Steel deck has fallen out of favor, because Blue Red has forced it into a less common choice. So really the best advice I can give you with Blue Steel is similar to that of the Steel Song deck, or just hope you dodge it through a lot of the matches. It's winnable, but you're like a 35% on the play chance of winning this match. It's so difficult. Their units are so good at singing. They're so good at invalidating what you're trying to do with your steel control by way of Cogsworth. They're so good at answering multiples for 1, playing the most copies of Grab Your Swords of any deck just about, and the most copies of Tinkerbell Giant Fairy. It's just a nightmare matchup. It is super hard to win, but it is doable through early aggression and then being able to leverage a really good draw 7 once they fire it off. Hard to make them pay the same way Steel Song can. That's why this matchup's harder. You can't just be like, oh, take out your Cogsworth. It's got Ward. So it just gets to sing A Whole New World, and then they get to immediately start using their ink first to do something like Tinkerbell, and then it's just, game over. It's a really difficult matchup, but there's got to be one, right? Every deck has a bad matchup. This happens to be this deck's worst matchup. Mufasa is a mostly favorable matchup for us. You really are looking to come out of the gate with the aggressive start, because they have no choice whatsoever until 6 to just challenge your units in order to get them off the board, which means that you, again, like the red-purple match, you get to take advantage of being able to have them discard, and if you have John, convert that into card advantage for you, while you strip out all of their late game cards, or they're forced to ink them. If they draw a Stitch Carefree Surfer or more expensive character than that, they basically have to ink it because they know they're going to lose it. The one character that gives you pause in this matchup, and this actually like a nightmare if they can get it down, is Chernobog. The only Mufasa game that I lost over the course of playing it 2 separate matches was when my opponent played Chernobog. It was the only time I was like, uh-oh. And I had Along Came Zeus in my hand, but still had to trade in 2 units plus an Along Came Zeus to deal with Chernobog, and it set me so far back that I wasn't able to recover as they just played medium-sized threat onto the board and gained a little bit of advantage to get them back into the game. So Chernobog is really the only card that gives you pause here. So other than that, the goal, like with red purple, is shut them down before they can get to 6 ink. If you can get rid of all their cards in their hand by 6 ink, you basically are on easy street. They do have Lantern to help them ramp in some cases, so it can be a little bit tougher than the red-purple match in terms of getting them down to stuck on 5. But if you can lock them out of the game at 5, the game is basically over. You can also leverage your aggressive starts, and there's almost nothing they can do about it because they're stuck with so few 1 or 2 drops. And their 2-drop will typically trade because it's usually Mother Gothel. So their 2 is going to end up trading you for like a 1/2 Flynn Rider. Like, it's a terrible trade-off for them. Or they'll try to leverage Rapunzel, in which case you just get to let the Storm Rage on the Mother Gothel, draw a card, and knock it off the board. It is a hard matchup for them, no doubt. So definitely a favorable one for us. Moving into the purple steel decks, this is largely unfavorable, kind of irrespective of whether they're Jafaring or not. For the same reasons that blue steel is unfavorable, purple steel is also relatively unfavorable because they have Tinkerbells, they have Grab Your Swords, they have those cards that can like 5-for-1 us. It's just really bad in terms of being able to overcome. It is doable, and they are also a wheel deck, right? Like, you hear me saying the wheel decks are typically unfavorable. It's because they also tend to play Grab Your Swords in a lot of cases. So those cards are kind of a disaster for us. It is very, very... Of the 3 steel decks that I've talked about, I haven't yet talked about the mirror, but of the 3 steel decks I've talked about, this is the most beatable. They tend to be the most frail, and their early units tend to be some of the most easily overcome. Hook and Blue Fairy are super easily answered with a little bit of removal. Ursula does work overtime here, being able to snipe out key songs from their hand, and you can just basically lock them out of the game almost entirely. As long as you have some larger units like a Smee and a Hook on board, it's really hard for them to come back. Friar Tuck tends to shine here. Daisy Duck, Donald Duck is good in this matchup because you can just keep stripping out the cards that you give them while he has 5 willpower and is just able to absorb a lot of damage. It's really, I think, a favorable matchup here. When it comes to keeps, I think you generally want to keep the Ursulas as much as you can, and 1 to 2 damage-based cards. I like Baboom here just because it's harder for them to take, and it deals with Captain Hook and Blue Fairy very, very easily. So it's quite a nice one to have. But any song's good here because they just really can't interact with it. So that's quite good. 3-drop Ursula is susceptible to getting nuked on sight. Especially if you're on the draw, they are going to Along Came Zeus that card because it can wreck them so spectacularly if you are able to just sudden chill out a bunch of cards from their hand. So it is worth noting not to overstretch into Grab Your Swords. Be weary of the whole new worlds and try your best to, again, get that aggressive start and then stop them really hard with your discard. So nothing new, but a definitely difficult matchup when they're playing Tink and Swords. Last but not least, I'm going to kind of do 2 decks at one time, and that is the Emerald Purple Tempo deck and the Emerald Steel Mirror match. I don't want to dedicate a ton of space to either one because they're very, very similar in how they work. There are a few things that you need to know different about each one, but I will tell you right now, and you're going to hear my page for a second as I push this down, you have to mulligan to the cards that are the hardest to interact with typically. And I'd say for the mirror match, the first one / the one who has used John Moore will be the winner of the match. It is definitely the case of the more they go down, the more you get to go up. So the more resources you get access to, the better off you are in the matchup. You can certainly win without seeing more cards, but it's going to require something like an Ursula, or for your opponent to draw relatively dry, like they're drawing discard when you have no hand. And sometimes you have to just run your hand out. Sometimes you have to just be like, I'm going to play Merfolk, Flynn Rider, and that's all I have in my hand, and now I'm going to try to invalidate all of your discard for the rest of the game. But that's a dangerous road to hoe, because if you have a John down and you happen to make them discard and you draw, you could have a card stranded in your hand that you can't play, like a 5-drop that's uninkable, for example. Just why I do not have Kuzco in the list. I opted for Don Carnage in that spot, because worst case I can ink him. He also doesn't get taken out by Medusa, is the other big reason he is in there, unlike Ray, who I tried and just was sad every time he got Medusa'd. So it's really, really important to make sure you understand that. You have to respect 2-drop Ursula here. Whether it's the mirror or the purple matchup, 2-drop Ursula is probably at its best in either of these matchups. If you can snatch a card out of their hand with 2-drop Ursula and you manage to not have the same happen to you, you are probably winning. Again, it's all about card advantage. The more access to cards, the more you can win. These cards are so cheap to play in terms of ink cost that you have no problem deploying multiple cards as you draw them most of the time. So it's really important to just simply be able to see more cards. That's why against the purple-green decks, it's really important you do not let them, friends on the other side, Ursula, or Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo, they're rabbits. They can just draw a whole new hand, and you're just like, oh no, I can't win. It's kind of like a one-sided whole new world in a lot of cases. While it's not 7 cards, the 4 cards they get in either case are close to enough to be able to push you out of the game. So you have to be really careful. I will give you a tip for the purple decks. Take out their Pinocchio. I don't care if you have to challenge it with a Flynn Rider. Take out their Pinocchio. If they cannot pick up and put down Pinocchios, you're in a much better spot, because then you're dictating the pace of the game. So that is super duper important in the purple matchups. Take out Pinocchio almost at all costs. I don't know if it's always right to say challenge it with a Prince John. It really depends. If that's their only unit on board, I would be tempted to, just because Pinocchio can do so much harm in the matchup, because then they get to dictate the pace at which they get to challenge your threats. So it's super duper important here. So to oversimplify the mirror match / the tempo deck, it's really important to make sure that you are being careful, right? You can play a tempo game against the tempo deck. You can use Cloud Kicker to bounce things. And then you get the cool, possibly have John sing or play Sudden Chill, and they discard and draw a card from the John trigger. So there's some really neat things you can do. Don't count yourself out. Wait for your top decks. Take your time. You don't always have to rush. So I'll get more into that here in the conclusion. I just want to take a minute to thank everybody so much for giving this a quick view. I hope this helped you in some regard to understand the matchup from the Emerald Steel side, whether you're playing against it and you want to know your foe, or you're playing with it, or you're interested in just seeing what the deck's all about to help you in your decision process. I really hope that if this has given some value to you in understanding what you're doing with the deck. And I know that a lot of what I said is a little redundant, but that's because I'm talking about how to best operate the deck, how the deck functions at its best, and it's to execute a game plan like any good deck, right? That is our game plan. Be aggressive and whittle out the late game cards by way of discard. That is the strategy. It does vary in how we do it, though, and it varies at what point are you emphasizing the discard, what point are you emphasizing interacting with the board and being aggressive. Either way, it plays very similar to the green-purple decks, in that we're trying to slow down what the opponent can do while we are trying to advance ourselves towards victory. We have to trade units we may not want to trade. We may have to take different trade-offs that aren't favorable for us. As long as they push us towards the end game of getting to 20 lore before our opponent, that is okay with this deck. You can go down in cards, because later in the game you can convert and turn their card advantage into card advantage for you, right? You sap the cards out of their hands. So if they go up in cards, have faith in the process. You will be able to sap them down. Don't just trade off your Johns. Don't just give up and be like, well, I'm just going to turn them into Quest or 2. I know it's tempting sometimes, especially if you're playing against steel decks that run Grab Your Sword, or if your opponent could have a Be Prepared. Sometimes you just go, you know what? I have to Quest with this John. Sometimes it's correct. Sometimes it's not. take stock in knowing that sometimes off the top you can rip a discard and go, oh, well, if their card is Be Prepared, I'm going to play it. A lot of players don't know or aren't comfortable with using a card like Be Prepared to take care of one Prince John. And sometimes it's correct for them to do so because you have Ursula's, because you have Sudden Chills, because you have Hypnotize, because you have Lucifer. You're able to strip cards out of their hand really easily. So them sitting on a card, especially a song that's uninkable, is bold. And I think as the meta has grown to see an increase in the Emerald Steel decks, I think more pilots now on the Be Prepared side of the game are willing to go, you know what, I'm just playing this thing. I don't care if I'm getting rid of one or two characters that are negligible. I'm just playing this now. And that's totally valid because getting rid of a Prince John is good. Prince John, definitely one of the strongest cards in the match. Not always, but through most of the matchups, you heard me say how important it was to have John on 3 if possible. It's because he can turn that card disadvantage into card advantage for you, which gives you fuel into the mid-game and hopefully lets you carry the inflection points of the game and end the game quickly as an aggro deck wants to do, right? I want to get from the early game to the mid-game to the late game as fast as possible, usually between turns like 1 and 6. I want this game to be wrapped up and either inevitable or me shuffling my cards for the next game. So keep that in mind as you navigate through these particular matchups. Just be aware of critical cards that beat you. Don't be afraid to go, you know what, I made a mistake. The important thing is, you know, going forward that you're not going to make that mistake again. This is a really hard deck to navigate, and it can really be a punishing deck when it's just like, oh, you want to mulligan away 4 cards? Well, here are 4 worse cards, or here are 4 of the same cards that do nothing in this matchup. It can be extremely disheartening at times. But on the other side of the coin, knowing these critical operations can get you out of a lot and take those medium poor cards that you have and convert them into late game, very impactful ones. So it's all about learning how to navigate everything you have on extraordinarily limited resources, knowing when you should ink. Should you not ink on the 3rd turn? That's weird, but sometimes correct, depending on what you need to do. Think every single game action through with this deck, because you get to make so many less than the average deck. Every single game action you take is critical. One missed ink. I inked the wrong card. One misspent card, one wrong target will cost you the entire game. And this deck will keep you up at night because you will be able to know exactly what point in the game you lost it. And you will always be able to find an inflection point that you probably didn't dictate correct. Take it as a learning opportunity. Trust me, I beat myself up a bunch playing this deck, but I was able to learn it quickly, and I was able to get better at it very quickly to where I was very confident going into the later set championships that I was playing the right deck and I was going to pilot it pretty darn well. So don't be afraid of making the mistake. Just make sure no matter what, you're thinking every game decision through, because you're going to make so many less of them. You'll have plenty of time. These matches go fast. So think every decision through, make sure it makes sense. Think out your entire turn. Make sure your sequencing makes sense. Be deliberate and methodical with how you play this deck. Make sure you are learning from every mistake you make and why you're losing, even if it's not a mistake. Make sure you take note. Why did you lose that game? Did you not get a card? Did your opponent get a card? Then you know these certain things are really, really important ones to make sure to bring mentally to the next game or into the next match against that particular deck. So it's all about leveling yourself up and learning with this deck. It is really a fun deck to play, but a very, very daunting one, no doubt. So take your time, and I hope that you got some useful information out of this Emerald Steel Primer. Thanks so much. If you like this video, of course, give it a quick sub. Give us a like. We appreciate all of those YouTube things. Let me know in the comments if there's something you want to see coming up, if there's something you would like me to do differently. If I do another one of these, it's my first foray into a deck tech. I just wanted to bring my experience with it to you in the hope that my mistakes or my successes can be value to you. So until next time, ink more cards. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out what to say at the end of these. Bye.